Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Gibo, and I'm the director of the Cohen Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2025 Genocide Awareness Lecture featuring Professor Victoria Sanford. New Hampshire Governor Kelly Ayotte recently issued a proclamation declaring April as Genocide Awareness Month across our state. And tonight's event is one part of the Cohen Institute's response to that call for promoting education in this area. We hope you'll leave tonight's event with a greater understanding of the atrocities that have played out in Guatemala, and also how people have responded in meaningful ways. Tonight's event will last until 7:00 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, so for 1 hour. After I introduce Professor Sanford, she's going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a brief discussion about her work before drawing the program to a close. Before we dive in, I just want to remind our audience that unauthorized audio, video, and other recordings of tonight's lecture are prohibited, but we will be posting the video of the Institute's on the Institute's YouTube channel soon, so we invite you to follow that account if you want to watch the video later. In preparation for tonight's event, the Cohen Institute hosted a series of events about Guatemala during the month of March. Keene State College's own Dr. Lisa DiGiovanni shared a powerful historical overview of Guatemala in the 20th century. And then Otia Luxtecote subsequently joined us to discuss Indigenous peoples and women's rights in Guatemala. And last week, many of you were with us as we welcomed El Chapincito food truck to campus so that students, staff, and community members could try Guatemalan food, for some people for the first time. Along the way, we've collected ideas and questions to integrate into tonight's discussion. Tonight's lecture is also the final event in the Cohen Institute's year-long series on forensics and genocide, which has comprised a total of 5 speakers and drawn a crowd of more than 200 attendees thus far. I want to thank Dr. Catherine Winters-Michaud from the Cohen Institute for planning and coordinating this year-long series, as well as Michelle Kiawa for helping to make it a reality. I also want to note that tonight's lecture is made possible through a transformative gift that the Cohen Institute received from Rick and Jan Cohen in September 2024. We are so grateful to be able to host this program and other new offerings as a result of this gift. The title of tonight's lecture is Friends Who Disappear, Documenting the Guatemalan Genocide and Forced Disappearance. And Professor Victoria Sanford is our featured guest. Tonight, we're going to learn about the forensic investigation into Dr. Marvyn Perez's childhood disappearance and torture by Guatemalan state forces. We will learn about the complicated history of, quote, forced disappearance in Guatemala and the role of the United States in this practice as well. And Professor Sanford will also illuminate how methods from forensic anthropology have been applied to exhumations of mass graves in investigations of forced disappearances to provide evidence of responsibility for ongoing genocide court cases. We're honored to host Professor Victoria Sanford tonight. She's a public scholar, an anthropologist, and an internationally recognized expert on the Guatemalan Genocide. She also serves as the Lehman Professor of Excellence at Lehman College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Professor Sanford is the author of 7 books, including one called Buried Secrets that is directly related to the Cohen Institute's series on forensics and genocide. Among her many, many accolades, I would highlight that she served as an invited expert in the Spanish National Court's genocide case against the Guatemalan generals, and also in an indigenous land rights case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. This year, she is the Senior Research Fellow at the University of Southern California's Center for Advanced Genocide Research. I could go on, but then we would not have time for her lecture. So instead, I will now turn the Zoom mic over to Professor Sanford to share her slides and to begin her remarks with us for tonight. Victoria, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Kate. I want to thank you and also thank Catherine Winters-Machon for organizing this wonderful event. And of course, the Cohen Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Kean College and its supporters who make these kinds of important events possible. I'm really happy to share with you today, and I want to try to keep to time. So I am going to go straight to setting up my slides and start this. Okay, there we go. So we're all on together. Today, this talk is The Disappearance of Guatemala, which comes out of work that I have been doing since 1993, actually, on this particular case. This is an image from a wall in Guatemala. It's graffiti that says, "My name is Ishmael Salanik. I was disappeared by the army 30 years ago. This was my barrio." And the date is February 14th, 1984. So this was from last year. I want to just run quickly through, because I don't really have in 40 minutes time to talk about all the different issues, but I'll run you through my books that will give you an idea. As Kate generously said in her very kind introduction, this is my first book, Buried Secrets, Truth and Human Rights in Guatemala, and it traces the exhumation of mass graves of genocide victims in indigenous villages in the early 1990s, before the Truth Commission even started, before the peace accords had been signed. This book was published in Guatemala in 2003. And this is me in Guatemala in 1994, working on the exhumation in Plan de Sanchez with Fernando Moscoso, who was the founder of the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation. This was one of the emblematic cases, and in fact, it was one of the cases that went to the Spanish National Court. And also the first case in the Inter-American Court where it was recognized as genocide. In that same year, 2003, this book, which was an abbreviated version of the part of Buried Secrets where I talk about the command responsibility of General Efrain Rios Montt, who had come to power through a military coup in 1982. And that was when the genocide really hit its apex, was under his dictatorship. And in 2003, if you can believe it or not, he was running for re-election. And so this book, this part of my book, was translated and published by F.A. Editores in Guatemala as part of a national effort to get the truth out about what had happened in the genocide. 2003 is less than 10 years after it's actually less than 5 years after the publication of the Truth Commission report. And as I'm sure many of you are aware from the illustrious speakers you've already had come through, that the genocide in Guatemala remains contested because there hasn't been a complete justice for the people who suffered through that genocide. And there's still debates about what happened, although there are advances that have been made. One of the things that's interesting about doing this work over the arc of time is this book, Genocidio na Guatemala, the first general condemned in Latin America, is actually a Portuguese publication of my book, Violencia Genocidio en Guatemala, that section about command responsibility from Buried Secrets, that was published just last year in 2024 in Brazil, because of the charges that many have brought against Bolsonaro for genocide of indigenous people in Brazil. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting and important about human rights work on crimes against humanity and genocide is that they have relevance not only in the places that may be the places of our study, but they are meaningful and can matter in other parts of the world as other people seek justice. As I'm an anthropologist, I'm a public anthropologist. That means that I don't believe in the production of knowledge for knowledge's sake. I believe in the production of knowledge for making the world a better place to live. And this was a book I did with my colleague, Aseli Angel Ajani. It's an edited volume about anthropology, advocacy, and activism from the early 2000s. That's an image that I took in a peace community in Northern Colombia, probably in 2001. And then I published this book, La Masacre de Ponzos, The Massacre in Ponzos, Ethnicity, Land, and Violence in Guatemala. This book came out of research that I did with the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation for the Guatemalan Truth Commission. A small part of it was published in the Truth Commission report in 1999, but as a public anthropologist, I'm also really committed to taking my work back to the community where I do my research. And so this book was presented in Ponzos. That's Maria Maquin sitting next to me. She was a child survivor of that massacre. She figures prominently in my book. And I was invited to Ponzos by the people of Ponzos to present this book. And it was one of the highlights of my life. I'm very happy to be here with all of you this evening, but truly going back to Ponzos and having all these people come to hear the story of their community and participate in the discussion was really powerful for me. This is another project, Guatemala from Genocide to Feminicide. I don't have a lot of time to go into that, but you could ask in questions or email me if you want. But this came out also in 2008. And then that led to work that I was doing on gender violence during the genocide. And this is an edited volume that I did with my colleague Katerina Stefados, who works in Greece. And it's about gender violence in peace and war and states of complicity, what the state role is in gender violence. You can find that to look up more information. I'm going to whiz on by. And then that led to also publishing this book with the same focus on sexual violence during the genocide in Guatemala with my colleagues Sofia Alvarez Arenas and Kathleen Dill. This powerful image was taken by my friend and colleague Ulf Anir, who's a Swedish photographer up in the Ischl area in 1982. We did this book because we realized in conversation that we had received many of the same stories in different parts of the country. And so this was our effort to bring those stories together and help to create an archive of information about the specific violence that women suffered during the genocide. And my most recent book was Textures of Terror, The Murder of Claudine Isabel Velasquez and Her Father's Quest for Justice. That was published in 2023, and it's about the phenomenon of the killing of women in Guatemala. But today I'm going to talk about disappearance. And before I get to Marvyn's story, I'm going to very quickly tell you a little bit about the history of forced disappearance in Guatemala. Many of you know who've been following the previous talks that in 1954, there was a US-backed military coup that overthrew democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. What followed that was a series of different military dictatorships and corrupt governments. In 1966 is the first time there was a mass disappearance in Guatemala. 28 members of the Guatemalan Workers' Party were disappeared. It was called Operación Limpieza, the Operation Cleansing, cleaning. It's a political cleansing. And it was a combined operation between the military, paramilitaries, and police. And they used rural and urban intelligence units. Their pretext was terrorism, but their goal was really to eliminate political participation of the left in the government in Guatemala. And at that same time, the CIA reported that communists and terrorists were executed by Guatemalan authorities. And so what this declassified document tells us is that the US government was aware of what was going on because, in fact, in March of 1966, they're reporting that on March 6th, in the evening of 1966, these leaders of the Guatemalan Workers' Party were killed in Guatemala. And so what were the responses of the Guatemalan government at this very same time about the disappearance of the Guatemalan Workers' Party leaders? The Guatemalan government denied any knowledge or involvement. The Guatemalan president promised to investigate, and the Guatemalan president did nothing to investigate. In 1980, 14 years later, is when the next massive disappearance happens in Guatemala. This time it's union leaders. 43 members of the Central National Workers Union disappeared between June 21st and August 24th, 1980. This was under Guatemala's national security doctrine. And in the same way that the Guatemala's Workers' Party was seen as an enemy party in 1966, by 1980, if you were a union member, you were seen as an insurgent. And disappearances of these leaders of unions were preceded by bombings, beatings, stolen archives, government infiltrations, death threats, and surveillance. And so this brings us to 1982. I seem to have, let me go back. I missed the responses. I want to share this because this is something that we'll see over and over again. These are the government responses, right? So the Guatemala City roads were blocked by uniformed officers, and union activists were dragged away by more than 60 masked men dressed in civilian clothes, responding to officer orders, right? So they're in civilian clothes, but they were responding to officers who were in uniforms giving orders. But the Guatemalan government denied knowledge. The Guatemalan government declared that the disappearances were orchestrated by extremists to cause problems. The Guatemalan government then regurgitated 6 of those individuals who'd been disappeared, but the rest were never seen again. So now we'll get to 1982, 2 years later. Some of the black and white photos that you'll see today, these were shared with me by my friend and colleague, Larry Tal, who's a phenomenal Canadian photographer, an award-winning photographer. And these are photos that he took in Guatemala in 1986 and 1987. So I'll begin Marvyn's story now. Imagine you're 14 years old and are among the privileged minority in your country who go to high school. You've joined a student organization protesting cuts to education and lack of access to public schools. You and your friends have made some leaflets demanding your rights to education and want to distribute them. But you live in a country where being caught with this kind of leaflet has a legal definition: possession of subversive literature. And it is a punishable crime. You're a really good basketball player, on the national team, in fact. You're strong, fast, and daring. You have some firecrackers, which are legal because they are made with gunpowder by the same people who make army munitions. You meet up with 2 of your friends from school, and you put the leaflets in a paper bag with some of the firecrackers. One of your friends extends the firecracker fuse with toilet paper, broken off match heads, and water. You attach the paper bag of leaflets and firecrackers to the pulley you and your friends have rigged with some square knots in a piece of rope you've thrown over a lamppost on a busy street. It is exhilarating. One of your friends lights the fuse and you start to run down the street. You turn to watch the leaflets floating through the dark, smoky air as you hear the crackle and boom of the firecrackers. You're awestruck by the spectacle you have made with your friends. You start to smile, but just as you're about to congratulate your friends, you hear the sirens. You and your friends run and hop on a bus. You get off the bus at the next stop and get on another bus, but the siren follows you until the bus stops for the siren instead of the bus stop. The police get on the bus. They order all the passengers off and separate the men from the women. They search everyone. Then they call you and your friends. The uniformed police say, "We know who you are. Don't play stupid." They begin to beat you with the butts of their rifles as they push you into their car. As the car drives away, one of them looks and says to you, "I want to cover you with gasoline and light a match. Then you'd talk." This is what happened to Marvyn when he was 14, and this is barely the beginning of his story. In May of 1982, my friend Marvyn and his sisters were disappeared. Marvyn's father was a poor shoemaker. His family lived in the neighborhood of La Palmita in Zone 5, one of the poorest barrios in Guatemala City. Sometimes Marvyn would help his father repairing shoes before going to school. This always made him nervous because the odor of the shoemaker's glue clung to him, and the teachers would assume that he had been sniffing glue, not working with his father. In Guatemala, public school children must pay for their uniforms, supplies, and books. So attending school means that the children are not working to contribute to household survival, and they need extra resources to get to school and pay for school supplies. To improve the future lives of their children, Marvyn's parents decided that his mother would travel to the Los Angeles to work as a housekeeper and send the money home to keep the children in school. His father would supervise them and keep them out of trouble. Don Jose also worked a second job as a laborer at the newspaper El Imparcial. When he came home from work on Saturday, May 29th, he didn't know Marvyn had already been sequestered by the National Police in a coordinated abduction of 16 Guatemala City school children belonging to the youth organization Robin Garcia Revolutionary Student Front, the FERG. His father was also unaware that Marvyn and his two sisters, Noemi and Lisette, were FERG activists. Don Jose felt something was amiss when Marvyn did not return home from his basketball game by Saturday evening. He searched for his son in the streets, in the end convincing himself that Marvyn must have stayed at a friend's house. Don Jose and Marvyn's sisters became fearful for Marvyn's safety when he did not return home on Sunday. They began to search everywhere, but Marvyn had disappeared without a trace. While Don Jose worked on Monday, May 31st, Noemi and Lisette went searching for Marvyn at hospitals, jails, and detention centers. Imagining that he had been picked up because of his involvement in the student organization and fearful that they would also be picked up, Noemi and Lisette cut their hair short to change their appearance before they went out. When Don Jose returned home from work and found Marvyn was still missing, he went to the police, the Red Cross, and every hospital he could find searching for his son. As they walked home from a long day of searching for their younger brother, Noemi and Lisette were abducted by police around 10 p.m. Certain that torture awaited her, Noemi resisted her abduction by screaming, kicking, and fighting, even attempting to kill herself by heaving her own body in the path of oncoming traffic. Other children were picked up this same night, including their friend Sandra, who had been at the family home to offer moral support to Don Jose. All these children were taken to the same station where Marvyn's father had sought assistance in his search for Marvyn. They were taken to the same station where police and army officers had been torturing Marvyn and his friends since their abduction on May 29th. One by one, each of these children was hooded and taken into an adjacent room. When not the hooded subject of police interrogations, they could hear what was happening to their friends, the punching, the kicking, the shouting of the police, and all was followed by the screams and moans of their friends. Like the Argentine mothers of the Plaza de Mayo seeking their disappeared children, Guatemalan organizations of families of the disappeared, like the Mutual Support Group, the Association of Families of the Detained and Disappeared of Guatemala, and the National Coordination of Widows of Guatemala, were formed by family members who met in their search for their missing loved ones. They met in hospitals, morgues, police stations, outside army barracks, and in street protests as they searched for their missing loved ones. They sought assistance from anyone who would listen. Often they were shunned by friends and family who, driven by their own fears of repression from security forces, mirrored the Guatemalan army's relentless ideology of guilt by association. After Sandra's abduction from the Perez family home, other friends and family members were too afraid to talk to Don Jose or go near his home, much less accompany him in his search for his missing children. But Don Carlitos, a friend from their neighborhood, overcame all these layers of fear to accompany Marvyn's father in his expanded search for his children. On June 1st, Don Jose filed an official missing persons report at the very police station where his children were being held. He also told a reporter at Imparcial, the newspaper where he worked, about the disappearance of his children, and a journalist began to help him in this search. Articles about the missing children began to appear in Guatemalan newspapers despite the deep censorship faced by the press. Don Jose called his wife in Los Angeles. She used the family savings and borrowed from everyone she knew to fly back to Guatemala to help her husband search for their missing children. The distraught parents did not return to their home for fear of being abducted as well. Every day was a new round of travel to morgues, hospitals, and police stations in search of their children. By the time Marvyn, his sisters, and the other children were disappeared, the Guatemalan security forces had a well-developed system of disappearing dissidents, real, perceived, and imagined, even if they were children. After the abduction and illegal detention, whoever was disappeared simply vanished, never to be heard from again. Within the deeply embedded Cold War framework, the official response, if there was one, would be that the missing person had gone to Cuba or the United States or had joined the guerrillas in the mountains. On June 1, 1982, after suffering 3 days of torture at the hands of police and army officials in the police station, Marvyn and his friends were handed over to a clandestine security force by police and taken by this death squad to a clandestine jail. That same day, General Efrain Rios Montt's amnesty decree was front page news. As the children were pushed into the dark liminal space of the clandestine jail, Guatemalans throughout the country heard of Rios Montt's amnesty on the radio and read a full-page amnesty announcement in newspapers. The government military junta, this is what the announcement says, the government military junta calls on all persons and groups dedicated to subversion and terror to abandon their actions on the margins of the law and seek protection with amnesty. This is the only opportunity we have in Guatemala to find ourselves on the path of peace. Guatemalan, meditate and decide. Approach the nearest military post. There you will have security and guaranteed protection. Amnesty is the only opportunity we have in Guatemala to stop the pain and return to peace. Remember, your parents wait for you, your children call you, your family needs you, your country reclaims you. This was in virtually every newspaper in Guatemala at the time. Given their transfer from the police station to the clandestine jail, it was most likely the intention of the army police and their henchmen that the clandestine jail would be the final stop for Marvyn and the other children. But the conflation of forces in the disappearance of Marvyn, his sisters, and their friends produced a public outcry about the missing students. In addition to articles in El Imparcial, the newspapers El Gráfico, La Hora, La Tarde, and Prensa Libre also ran stories about the disappearances of the children. Don Carlos was interviewed by radio and television news. The government was forced to make a public response about the disappearance of the children. On Wednesday, June 2nd, when Marvyn had been disappeared for 5 days, La Tarde reported, with no byline, as became a practice of journalists in fear of repression for doing their job. The story read that 32 students were known to have been abducted in Guatemala City and Sololá within the past 2 months. In most cases, the students were violently removed from their homes by heavily armed men in civilian clothing. Often these men dragged the children from their parents and shoved them into unmarked vehicles, quote, with characteristics similar to those of police cars, threatening the parents as they left and warning them not to denounce the abduction. Marvyn's disappearance was included along with his sisters Noemi and Lisette, as well as their friend Sandra, who had been dragged from their home. La Tarde also reported that the National Police had information about the abductions of other students, naming William Teny Mendez, Edwin Reynaldo Guzman, Edwin Francisco Catalan Chicarda, and Elias Virgilio Lopez Corso as disappeared minors. Also named were Sololá students, 15-year-old Mario Estrada Atz and 16-year-old Abraham Guarcos Hoc. La Tarde noted that some suggested that the victims belonged to student associations, but, quote, officially nothing is known about the cause. Following up on his amnesty decree, on June 3rd, 1982, Rios Montt, the general, said, "He who does not surrender will be executed." That afternoon, La Horta ran a front-page story without a byline with the banner headline, "The abduction of 8 students is alarming." Laura reported that 8 students had been abducted on their way home from school, and the story followed up on the previous day's coverage of the disappearance of Marvyn and his sisters, reported that all the parents were desperately searching for their missing children, and had informed the Ministry of Education about the multiple disappearances. The parents had written to the military junta of Rios Montt requesting intervention and investigation by the Ministry of the Interior that oversees the police and the Ministry of Defense that oversees the army. On June 4th, Diario El Gráfico emphasized the shocking nature of children disappearing with the headline, 8 secondary students disappear. 3 of them are siblings. This is an image of Marvyn and his 2 sisters, Noemi and Lisette. The government is worried about the disappearance of the students, ran the headline in Diario El Gráfico. The declaration of concern, another declaration of concern came from the Minister of Education, Luis Mérida, and Subsecretary of Public Education and Public Relations, Rafael Estrada Arguello, at a news press conference. I'm sorry, got stuck here. There we go. The government also stated that from the moment they became aware of the disappearance of the students, the case was communicated to the General Direction of the National Police for them to investigate it. So while they're holding the children, they're claiming that they have been investigating it. In particular, this public relations guy, Escobar Arguello, asserted that the army sent precise instructions to the police, telling them to exhaust all leads to find the students. Significantly, in this press conference, an unnamed individual questioned whether the authorities believed that the disappeared children could have been kidnapped by the subversives to turn them into guerrillas. The Minister of Education responded that they did not have enough information to form an opinion about this, but that their investigation would allow the authorities to determine the guerrilla involvement. And thus began the next cynical phase of government disinformation, distortions, and lies about the status and whereabouts of the disappeared children. On June 6, Diario Gráfico reported, again without a byline, that parents and teachers continued to seek the whereabouts of the disappeared students, seeking investigation from the police and the military junta. That evening, as the students entered their second torturous week in illegal detention, they received a short medical examination, were given bread, coffee, and were told by their torturers that on this night, they would find out whether they would survive. And the articles continue that parents are worried, that the government is worried, that we're continuing to search for them. And at this same time, the kids are still being held in this clandestine jail, and they're in one room. In another room, a television or radio was turned on at a volume loud enough for them to hear it, but they didn't know whether it was a television or radio because they were still blindfolded. They were listening to the Sunday sermon of General Efrain Rios Montt, who stated that the students were captured by his regime and would soon be released. After this announcement, the device was turned off. On June 7th, 1982, the full-page amnesty announcement was again reprinted. Reflecting Rios Montt's Sunday sermon, the government's position of worry about the whereabouts of the disappeared children shifted without explanation, and Diario El Gráfico reported that the detained students would be taken to military tribunals, juvenile tribunals. The Junta General Maldonado Shad claimed that authorities had discovered that the children belonged to guerrilla cells, and they were detained for subversive activities. Further, he warned that families will be called and informed about their children's activities, and parents must take responsibility for them. Still being held blindfolded in the clandestine jail on June 7th, Marvyn was led downstairs and into a small room with a table and chair. One of his tormentors removed his blindfold and sat Marvyn on the chair in front of a video camera with the television news logo, Aquí el Mundo. He was given a piece of paper and instructed to read it aloud several times. My name is Marvyn Perez. I am 14 years old. I am a member of the Robin Garcia Revolutionary Student Front, the January 31 Popular Front, and the Guerrilla Army of the Poor. Then they wrapped his face and head back up in newspaper and masking tape and led him back to the holding cell upstairs. The other children were forced to read similar statements. Still being held in the clandestine jail, the children were allowed to bathe and given breakfast. They worried all day for their families and for themselves. That night, though still handcuffed, for the first time, they were without shackles on their feet. Marvyn was very cold, but he slept. Before dawn, he heard voices in the distance and then was awoken by kicks and punches. He was told to stand up. A man removed the handcuffs and told him to dress quickly as he handed him pants, a shirt, underwear, socks, and a pair of black shoes. The last man to interrogate Marvyn told the children, "You have been saved from this. You are lucky, but remember, there is no second chance. Don't involve yourself in this foolishness. Study, help your parents. You have all seen my face. If one day you see me on the street, act like you have never seen me. If we run into each other on a bus, do the same thing. For you, I no longer exist. Blindfolded, the children were piled on top of one another into several cars to transfer them from the clandestine jail to another location where they were met by a fat uniformed police officer who removed their newspaper blindfolds. In the distance, Marvyn saw the vehicle from which they had disembarked driving away. It was a dark blue or gray Chevy Blazer. Marvyn was taken to a small, dirty cell with the other children. All told, there were 13 of the 16 who had been captured. As Marvyn and his sisters embraced, they realized that their friends Gato and Chino were missing. Marvyn recalled exchanging a few words with Gato through the walls of the clandestine jail, but that his voice was very weak. Chachalaco heard that Gato and Chino were captured and that Gonzo had been killed. The children were overcome with sadness and pain and rage. Still in the dark of night, they cried together and wondered what they could do to free Gato and Chino. As the sun rose on June 9th, the light came through the tiny window of their cell, and they realized they were back at the second precinct of the National Police where they had first been taken, the same police station where his father had made the complaint. "This is your breakfast," said the fat police officer who had returned with a bunch of bananas. Midday, police took their photos and fingerprints. They were told to leave the cell one by one in the corridor. There was a long line of heavily armed police and judicial police. They put the children into a Jeep Cherokee that formed part of a caravan, a motorcycle in front and one on each side, plus 2 radio patrol cars and 2 yellow Jeeps, each filled with police and judicial police. They soon reached the headquarters of the National Police and were taken to a large room with many chairs. A man who others called the lieutenant informed the children that they were going to be handed over to their parents, but first they would have to speak with the press. "You will tell them what we tell you to say, no more and no less." Shortly thereafter, the room filled with the Guatemalan press. The children read a paper that was similar to what they had read on video in the clandestine jail, but with many more words. In addition to name, age, and the organizations, they now had to read a list of subversive activities: propaganda bombs, graffiti, flyers, taking of businesses, assisting in the occupation of the Brazilian embassy, sabotage of private property, occupation of villages, harassment of government posts. The oldest children read an even longer statement representing the entire group and apologizing to the government and the people of Guatemala, thanking the regime for the amnesty, and specifically highlighting that they had been treated very well. Quote, "They treated us well. They did not hit us. They gave us good advice. They provided an orientation so we can understand the errors of our ways. We beg for forgiveness from our parents for the shame and suffering we've caused them. We promise to be good children, and we give thanks to General Efrain Rios Montt for giving us this opportunity to reintegrate into society." The following day, on June 10th, 1982, Guatemalan newspapers reported that 13 children who had been involved in subversive activities had received amnesty and were turned over to their parents. The journalist and subsecretary of public relations, Rafael Escobar Arguello, concluded the press conference stating that the detained were well treated by security forces. An unclassified State Department document from June 14, 1982 reported the government of Guatemala turns over 16 captured subversive juveniles to parents, 8 previously listed as missing, was the subject of this memo. It was sent by the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala to the U.S. Secretary of State the Monday after the kids were released. The U.S. Embassy noted that many of the students were previously reported by the press as missing were actually in the custody of the police. After listing the names of the 16, quote, student subversives without ever referencing their minor status, the memo concludes with the comment, "While the embassy wonders why the government of Guatemala did not arrest the students rather than abduct them, it is important to note that the students were not killed and were actually released to the custody of their parents." The U.S. Embassy memo, like the press, failed to include Carlos Medina, also known as Gonzo, who was executed, or Estuardo Marroquin, also known as Chino, and Raul Axel Lemos Garcia, also known as Gato, who are still missing, as are the other 16 children from Guatemala City and solo law, whose disappearances were reported in the press during that same period. So one of the things that's really important about Marvyn's story is that it shows command responsibility, because the government always claims that it had no knowledge. But this case shows government responsibility from the national police on the street, grabbing the kids, police intelligence at the local station, intelligence officials from the army in the local station, the death squad in the local station, the death squad taking the kids to the clandestine jail, and then regurgitating them back out through the administrative state. It shows government responsibility in the commission of the crimes, the toleration of the crimes, and the omission of responsibility to investigate and prosecute and sanction those responsible. The impact of La Violencia and the genocide, the findings of the Commission for Historical Clarification are that 626 villages were massacred, 1.5 million people were displaced, 150,000 people fled to refuge, and more than 200,000 dead or disappeared. 200,000 dead or disappeared includes 50,000 disappeared, 5,000 of whom were children. These are images that I mentioned earlier that Larry Tal, the great Canadian photographer, took in Guatemala in 1986 and 1987 at protests. And when I've shown these images in conferences or meetings where there are Guatemalans, they know who these people are because they've marched with them as well, looking for their own disappeared loved ones. And people still go today. This is a quilt that was made with the names of the disappeared. And these are images of disappeared students as well. So I'm going to stop there so we have some time for questions. I came in under my time, so I'm really proud about that. So I'm going to stop the share and come back to conversation. So I'm good. We're all in time, right?
Oh, that was amazing, Victoria. You are under time. So we appreciate that because we have so much time that we can delve into some of the nitty-gritty questions with you. So thank you. I just want to say also, I found your presentation extremely compelling personally in the sense of the way that you convey Marvyn's story. It brings the history to life in such a grounded and human-centered way that I think is so important for me as, you know, someone learning more about this genocide myself, and for our students and our audience as well. So thank you for what you've crafted for tonight. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So as I mentioned at the start, we have been collecting some questions to share with you for tonight from Cohen Center affiliates and students and other folks across our community. So I think I'm just going to dive into a few of those to start, and we'll see where our conversation leads us, if that sounds okay to you.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, so the first question, you know, you've written and spoken about how PTSD and intergenerational trauma have affected survivors of the Guatemalan Genocide. And some of us had the chance also to look at your most recent book, Textures of Terror, which starts in this moment that kind of feels like a moment of freedom after the Historical Clarification Commission that you also mentioned in your presentation tonight. So it's been, I think, a little less than 30 years since the commission operated and a little more than 50 years since the start of the Civil War. So kind of with all of that in mind, we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how the violence of the Civil War and this genocide have influenced Guatemala today and what you've seen in your work.
Sure. I think that's a really great question. And I would start by saying it wasn't a civil war, because if you have a civil war, you have two armed parties that are battling one another out. And while the army will say they were battling the guerrilla, when the peace accords were signed, there were 60,000 national police, 60,000 soldiers, I don't know, 20 or 30,000 judicial police, 20 or 30,000 immigration police, all told, and then plus 800,000 civil patrollers, citizens who were forced into government-controlled civil patrols around the country, which was basically 1 out of every 3 men in Guatemala were in a group that supported the army. The civil patrols were armed, but they didn't arm all of them because they were forcibly conscripted. So basically, you have a completely militarized society, and there were 1,500 guerrilla fighters who were demobilized. That's all there were, and they didn't even all have guns. So it was a genocide. So I think the question is also about what was the cause of the genocide. And I think that also brings us back up to the intergenerational trauma question. And so, I mean, I think the cause of the genocide is that there was a majority population of indigenous people in a country that's wealthy. People think of Guatemala as being a poor country, but it's actually a wealthy country. It's much wealthier than Costa Rica, for example. But Costa Ricans live well because they have a more equitable distribution of wealth than the country of Guatemala does. Guatemala has one of the most unequitable distributions of wealth in not just in the hemisphere, but in the world. In every single social indicator that you can name, Guatemala is the worst, except for Haiti, basically. That's the moniker on most of them. And so, you know, I would say that what happened in the 1980s was a preemptive genocide because the army looked around and the oligarchy looked around and they saw the Salvadoran guerrillas taking ground. Salvadoran guerrillas controlled 30% of the ground of El Salvador. The Sandinistas had taken power in Nicaragua, and they just thought, well, we're not going to let a bunch of Indians take over this country. I've had people say that to me. It's a racist comment to make, but that's what people have said. And I've even had former guerrilla commanders say to me, any Ladino, being a mestizo or criollo, a white Guatemalan, who's honest, will tell you that they fear the day that the Maya have control of the country, because what if they do to us what we've done to them? And there are more of them. And so I think it was a preemptive genocide. And because of the deep structural racism of the country, the indigenous people were not seen as full human beings. Because that's how racism works. And so I think, you know, the PTSD of intergenerational trauma, it comes from living, first of all, living in fear. I mean, if you think about just the story of Marvyn, like what happens to his family when the children are disappeared, all of a sudden people who love them don't go over there because they're afraid of what that will mean for themselves or for their children or their family. So you grow up with this kind of fear. And that trauma and fear is passed down. And people have, for several decades, people have talked about that in a kind of as a socio-cultural phenomenon. When I was up in the mountains with taking testimonies from massacre survivors, the indigenous women would tell me that their babies died because they transferred their sadness through their milk, right? And so I took that as a metaphor for the pain and probably that their milk had dried up. In fact, there are studies now that show that you can transmit trauma and that women who have experienced a lot of gender-based violence or other kinds of trauma, that it actually changes the structure of the DNA and it changes the chemistry of their breast milk. So the indigenous women may not have had the scientific vocabulary to explain that phenomena, but their description was accurate. So, and we now know that you have actual changes to your DNA as a result of these kinds of trauma. So I think that's a really great question. I hope I answered it.
Yeah, you did great justice to that question, so thank you. And as you're talking about the experiences of women in particular, I think this is a really nice connection to a couple of other questions that we got. So I'm going to throw all of this at you and you can kind of sift through and decide what among this you want to answer. But, you know, in addition to the forced disappearances of children that you talked about tonight, you also mentioned in your talk that there was this systematic violence against women during the Guatemalan genocide as well. So we have some folks who are interested in knowing a little bit more about why women were targeted in Guatemala as part of the genocide. And we also received a question about whether you could discuss the interconnected roles of militarization, including conscription as a practice, and gender, especially toxic masculinity, in the perpetration of the genocide in Guatemala. So I know I'm kind of throwing a mixture of things at you, but I see these as related in important ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I think they are related. They're related to gender violence of the past and gender violence of the present. First of all, you know, I think in if we look at Guatemala and the history of Guatemala, one of the it's a very machista society. It's a very hierarchical society. It's a very racist society. So part of the placement of women is women must be protected. right? Women must be protected, but that protection is also repression because it limits the space that women can move in. And so in the why were women targeted? Women were targeted because they're seen as property. And that's the first thing. Like women, so if someone's wife, a lot of the women I interviewed in rural communities, and this is also true in urban cities as well, they were raped. They were gang raped by military personnel or by civil patrollers, and they were told it was because their husband was in the guerrilla or because their cousin was in the guerrilla. I know one person who was gang raped, and they whispered in her ear, "You tell your uncle we did this to you, and that it's his fault," because they were accusing him of being in the guerrilla. So and that's also a way that in that framework of guilt by association, it's how people become isolated because people are afraid to go near you, but you're also afraid to go near them because you might contaminate their space with what you're perceived, real or perceived, whatever that dissidence may or may not be, that it will impact that. And so women are targeted as property, but in terms of the militarization and conscription, that's a really good question as well, because part of the training that these soldiers and the civil patrollers received was incredibly brutal and violent. I mean, they practiced violence on each other. They practiced with live munitions. The rape of women was referred to as recreation. Right? It was seen as a reward for doing a good job. And so the whole doing a good job killing, right? Doing a good job killing people. And so it was seen as a reward and or obligation. And at the same time, it also completely breaks down the community as well. And we see this in wars around the world, that women are victimized first by the invaders, and then when the men from their community come back, they're victimized by them because they're seen as dirty because those other men have raped them. And again, it's because of the unequal power relations of women. And I mean, I think these particular stories, when we took the testimonies for the Truth Commission, they did not have explicit questions about sexual violence in the way that we would ask the questions today. And a lot of women I spoke to would tell me "me golpearon," and I thought they were saying, "Well, he hit me. He hit me." And I realized a little bit later that was the word, that was the term they were using. Spanish was their second language for being raped by the soldiers. And I only discovered that because the woman I was speaking with said, "Mira, all of these women, the los golpes left us all pregnant. Half of us had babies, half of us took a remedy." Right. And so, I mean, and it was those were the shocking stories. And that's what led Kathy Dill and Sophia and I to write this book together, because we had been hearing these different kinds of stories, but in vastly different communities in different parts of the country. And one of the reasons it was really important to bring that together is because it showed that sexual violence was a systematic practice, that it wasn't a random practice, it wasn't a rogue practice, but in fact, it was systematic. And the recent court cases in Guatemala have shown that as well.
I mean, it's fascinating and deeply disturbing, everything that you're sharing, Victoria. It's also a really great setup, actually, for a series that the Cohen Institute is planning to run next year. So our year-long series for next academic year in 2025-2026 is going to focus on the intersections of gender and genocide. And I think what you're sharing with us now is really providing fodder for questions that we can continue to examine as a community and, as a campus moving forward. So thank you. And I won't be surprised if we reinvestigate some of your other writings and books as part of that series as well. So thank you. I wanted to turn to one other question as well, which is thinking about the role of the educational system in Guatemala today. We have some teachers who are with us in the audience tonight and some education majors at Keene State College, I know as well. So one question that we received was, has the Guatemalan education system confronted this difficult past? And if so, to what degree do you feel it has allowed Guatemalan people to wrestle with this difficult history?
And that is a fabulous question. And so the Guatemalan education system is part of the Guatemalan state, and so it has not done a good job of confronting this past. when I was doing research in Guatemala, and these books are still floating around today, this would be in the late 90s, early 2000s, the standard textbooks that were being used in Guatemala said that the worst thing that ever happened in Guatemala was the earthquake of 1976. And that's not unusual in countries that have had extreme repression. They'll look at whatever a disaster, a natural disaster was, and focus on that without really addressing in this case, the genocide. The Catholic Church, the Office of the Archbishop in Guatemala, the Office of Human Rights there, they did produce a really good high school textbook. And so that would be used in probably the Jesuit schools and maybe their Dominican schools, but not in the conservative schools. And so it really depends. And I have friends who talk about being in college at the university, public university, at the Catholic university at the Landivar, that is included in the education because the Catholic Church lost so many priests and nuns to that violence. And we're also involved in the Nunca Mas report that preceded the Truth Commission report. So there's a commitment in that community for the truth to be known. But in other places, it's kind of al-azhar. It depends. It depends on who the teacher is and whether the administration allows it to take place. And it's what makes independent presses in Guatemala really important. Like the press that publishes my books, F.A. Editores. One of the things that we do is I never get royalties for those books. We make those books, and the money that's made purchasing the books, we produce more books and put them in the libraries. So those stories are in the libraries. It's not just with my books, but with other books as well, to make that accessible and available to people and communities. There are 300 libraries in Guatemala. They're little tiny houses, little tiny rooms, but they're public libraries, and they're really important. They're a lifeblood for those communities.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll give you last word if there's anything else that you want to mention that you haven't had a chance to say yet tonight, Victoria. But you mentioned as part of your talk the role that you play as a public anthropologist and as part of your research, bringing what you're doing back to these communities in some of the ways that you were just mentioning now as well. And I'm curious to know a little bit about what brought you to this particular project with Marvyn. And, I know you mentioned before we started the webinar tonight that this is, I think, the basis of the next book that you'll be publishing, which is exciting. We're getting a preview of that tonight. But, you've written so extensively and have done so much in your career. So how did you land on this particular project?
Well, it's funny that I met Marvyn before I went to graduate school. I met Marvyn in Mexico in 1989. I was teaching English at the public university in Mexico, and in 1987 to 1989, that's a time of incredible political turbulence and repression throughout Latin America. And the Autonomous University of Puebla, like many of the universities in Mexico, welcomed exiled scholars and academics from around the world. So at the university where I was teaching, there were exiles from Argentina, from Chile, from Peru, from Guatemala. And because I was really interested in Guatemala, a Guatemalan couple who were there, I would spend time with them trying to learn more about it because I had been working with refugees before I started to teach English. And they said, "Oh, we want you to come over for dinner. We want to introduce you. We have some visitors." And I met Marvyn. He had just graduated from high school, and he was there with his girlfriend. They were looking at the medical school. And I didn't know he was a torture survivor then, so that he was probably 18 or 19 then. And that was when we first met, and we talked and had a conversation. But then later, I went back to Mexico in 1993 before I started graduate school. And because one of my friends in Mexico said, "Well, he's a torture survivor." And I said, "No, I didn't know that." And I said, I'd like to interview him or take his testimony if he's willing. And so he said yes through his friend. And I went and I met with him and I took his testimony. And that was the beginning of this journey that's now 3 decades long. We have gone through 13 different volunteer pro bono lawyers trying to seek justice for Marvyn. And the efforts at justice are really multi-pronged because one is to find out what happened to the other boys who were never seen again. Where are they? What happened to them? The other is to hold the people who were the victimizers accountable. Marvyn has done a tremendous job of investigating his own disappearance as information has become available. In police archives, we know the names of police who detained him. We have more information than we did in the past. He tried for more than a decade to get the prosecutor's office in Guatemala to move on the case, but they never did. And ultimately, the case was taken to the Inter-American Court through a law clinic at Loyola University here in LA. And now we have a really wonderful law firm that's doing pro bono representation in Costa Rica for the Inter-American Court case. And we're waiting to hear if it goes to court, and we expect that it will. Because and when you do that, you seek reparations. The Inter-American Court can't condemn the person. They can't condemn, but they can charge the state with responsibility. And so the government of Guatemala will have to respond, and you can request symbolic reparations. That's where you see schools built in the name of someone, or a monument, or some kind of creative symbolic project to remember the past. Administrative changes, which would be that the court could order the government of Guatemala to produce the documentation about what happened to these kids, and let that history be known. And then financial reparations for the victims who've survived. And so that's, I've just I always describe, I know we're running out of time, so I will make this last kernel my last comment as well. But I think if you do research for the common good, then you start a project, and then that project kind of takes you along. And that's kind of what happened. I was working with refugees, and I thought that was what I was going to do my work about, was immigration. And I ended up working with the forensic team, and then people thought I was a forensic expert. So I ended up helping out with these feminicide cases. And all along, Marvyn and I have always been trying to move his case forward. And I'm finally able now to write about it in a more holistic way that places its history in the current moment and Marvyn's search for truth over time.
Incredible. I mean, it's remarkable to think about what Marvyn's presence in your life has meant, and also the good scholarship and work that has come out of this collaboration between the two of you to trace all of this out together. It seems like a true partnership, which is inspirational. We don't always see that, right, in academic work. So I'm really glad that you shared that piece.
Thank you so much. No, I mean, it's truly, it's always an honor to work with people, but Marvyn's been my friend for over 30 years. We're like lifelong friends at this point, significant, working friendship. It's really been an amazing experience.
Wonderful. Well, Victoria, I think we could easily spend another 45 minutes together, but we are at a point where it's time to start wrapping up for tonight. I want to thank everybody who attended this evening's lecture. And for those of you in the audience, I hope you'll take the chance to look at the Cohen Institute's website to learn more about our other upcoming programs and events, including, what we're putting together for next year and the rest of this year. And Professor Sanford, Victoria, we're just so grateful. Thank you again for sharing your important research and your work with our audience tonight. We're so grateful and can't wait to stay in touch with you in the months ahead. So thank you, and wishing everybody in the audience tonight a peaceful rest of your evening. So be well, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. All right. Take good care, everybody.